He wasn't even looking at me when he said it. We were standing in the lobby of the Fairmont, 37 floors above downtown Toronto, and Nathan had just spent the better part of an hour telling me I was overreacting, that I was being difficult, that I needed to stop making everything about myself. And then, without missing a beat, without so much as lowering his voice, he turned to Amber, my colleague, my supposed friend, the woman I'd introduced to him at my own firm's Christmas party 2 years ago, and he said, I can't wait to start our life together. Just like that. In front of me. I didn't cry. I remember being surprised by that. I'd spent 3 years with Nathan, 3 years building what I thought was a shared future, and standing there in that marble lobby with the chandelier light catching Amber's earrings and the concierge pretending very hard not to exist, I felt something go perfectly, completely still inside me. I set my champagne flute down on the nearest surface. I smoothed the front of my dress, and I walked to the elevator. Nathan called after me twice. The second time, he actually laughed a little. That particular laugh he used when he wanted me to know I was being theatrical. I pressed the button for the parkade level and stared at the brass doors until they closed. What Nathan didn't know, what he had never once thought to ask about, in 3 years of dinners and weekends and conversations he mostly used to talk about himself, was who my father was. My name is Meredith Calloway, not Meredith Ashford, the name I'd been using at the firm. Calloway, as in Calloway Capital, the private equity group that quietly holds controlling interest in 14 companies across Ontario and British Columbia. As in Gerald Calloway, who last year was ranked among the 20 most influential financiers in Canada by the Globe and Mail. Gerald Calloway, who happens to be my father. Nathan had no idea. I should explain why. It's a fair question. Why would someone hide something like that? The honest answer is that I stopped telling people when I was 24, after a relationship ended, and I found a text on his phone to a friend of his that said, more or less, that I was worth staying with even though I was exhausting because of who my family was. I read that twice. Then I put his phone down, packed a bag, and called my dad from the parking lot of a Shoppers Drug Mart in Mississauga at 11 at night. My dad picked up on the second ring. He always did. After that, I moved to Toronto and I started over as Meredith Ashford, my mother's maiden name. I got my CFA designation. I joined a mid-sized financial advisory firm, Renner and Associates, on my own credentials, without a single call from my father on my behalf. I built something real. I wanted to know what I was actually capable of, without the Calloway name clearing the path in front of me. And for a while, it worked. I met Nathan at a conference in Vancouver in the spring, 3 years before all of this. He was charming in that particular way. Easy laugh, good at remembering details, made you feel like the most interesting person in the room. He worked in commercial real estate. He had a condo in Liberty Village and a golden retriever named Hudson, and a habit of talking about wine he didn't actually know much about. I found it endearing at first. I introduced him to Amber at our firm's holiday party in December of that same year. She was new, just transferred from the Calgary office. She was warm and funny, and I genuinely liked her. I thought they'd get along. I didn't think they'd get along that much. I won't catalog all the signs I missed or half noticed and filed away. That's not really what this story is about. What I'll say is that sometime in the second year, Nathan started to seem vaguely disappointed in me. In my apartment, which was modest by choice. In my salary, which was good but not spectacular. In my family, which I'd described as comfortable, and left at that. He started making comments. Not cruel, exactly. More like faint, persistent pressure. Did I think I should be further along by now? Had I considered moving to a bigger firm? Didn't I want more? I was 33. I'd built exactly what I set out to build. But Nathan wanted something larger. And I was starting to understand that I was a placeholder while he figured out what that was. By the time we got to that evening at the Fairmont, which was supposed to be a celebration of our 3-year anniversary, which he had planned, which I'd taken a half day for, I think some part of me already knew. I just hadn't let myself say it yet. He said it for me. I drove home that night on the Gardner with the radio off and the city lights doing what they always do, spreading out like something spilled. I wasn't shaking. I wasn't even particularly sad, which frightened me a little, because it suggested the sadness had already happened somewhere along the way, and I'd just been too busy to notice. I called my dad when I got home. It was nearly midnight. He picked up on the second ring. I told him everything. He listened without interrupting, which is one of his best qualities. When I finished, there was a pause and then he said, "Are you all right?" I said I was. He said, Good, then come home this weekend and we'll figure out the rest. I didn't tell him to do anything. I want to be clear about that. My father is not a man who needs to be asked twice, and he is not a man who does things halfway. But I did not pick up the phone that night looking for leverage. I called because he is my father, and it was midnight, and I was 33 years old, sitting on my kitchen floor in my good dress. And some things are just that simple. What happened next, I only pieced together afterward. It started small, or what looked small from the outside. Nathan's biggest active deal at the time was a mixed-use development in Etobicoke. A significant project, the kind that would have set him up for the next several years. The lead financing was coming from a consortium of private lenders. One of those lenders happened to have a quiet relationship with a fund that my father's firm had significant influence over. It was not a direct connection. It was the kind of connection that only becomes visible when someone looks for it. Someone looked. 2 weeks after the Fairmont, the lead lender withdrew. No explanation beyond standard risk reassessment language. Nathan actually called me, to ask if I'd heard anything through the firm. I said I hadn't, which was true. I genuinely hadn't spoken to my father about it. I hung up and made myself a cup of tea and sat by the window looking out at the street below, and I felt nothing in particular. Which told me I'd made the right decision about Nathan a long time before he made it for me. Then came the Amber part. Amber had been positioning herself for a promotion at Renner and Associates for the better part of a year. She was good at her job, I'll give her that. But a few weeks after the Fairmont, our managing director, a careful, precise woman named Christine, who had been in the industry for 25 years and had not gotten there by missing things, received an anonymous tip about a compliance issue involving a client file from Amber's time in the Calgary office. Christine took it to HR. HR opened an inquiry. I have no proof that my father had anything to do with any of that. I want to be honest about what I know and what I don't. What I know is that my father makes things happen by moving quietly through existing structures, and that he has never once, in my entire life, let someone hurt me without eventually understanding the cost of that decision. What I also know is that 2 weeks before any of this, I had driven up to his house in Rosedale on a Sunday afternoon, and we'd sat in his study, and I had told him the whole story, including Amber. He'd listened. He'd nodded once. He'd poured 2 glasses of scotch and handed me one and said, "Some people don't understand what they've walked into." That was all. I went back to my life. I kept going to work. I kept doing my job. I took on a new client file that was frankly more interesting than anything Nathan had made me feel in the last 8 months. And I had lunch with a colleague named Joanna, who made me laugh, for the first time in weeks, and I started running again in the mornings along the waterfront, the way I used to, before I'd spent 3 years slowly making myself smaller to fit into someone else's idea of a future. It was sometime in early spring when Christine called me into her office. She sat across from me with the particular stillness she deployed when something significant was happening. And she said she'd been doing some thinking about the firm's structure, and that she wanted to talk to me about a new role. Senior advisor, essentially building out a new division focused on private wealth clients. More autonomy, a meaningful increase in compensation. An office with an actual window, which sounds minor but isn't, after 2 years of a desk in the open floor plan. I asked what had prompted the change. Christine said she'd had a conversation with someone in the industry who spoke very highly of my work. She wouldn't say who. I didn't ask again. I accepted the role. I moved into the office with the window. The view faced west, toward the lake, and in the late afternoon, the light came in at an angle that made the whole room go amber and gold, and it felt, genuinely, like something beginning. Nathan's Etobicoke project fell through entirely in March. I read about it in a brief item in the Financial Post. He'd had to bring in a new financing partner at significantly worse terms. And then that partner had restructured at the last minute, and the whole thing had collapsed into a legal dispute that would take years to untangle. His name appeared once, in the second paragraph, as a co-developer. I set the paper down. I finished my coffee. I want to be careful here, because this is the part that's easiest to misrepresent. I'm not telling this story because I'm proud of watching Nathan's deal fall apart. I'm not even sure I was particularly glad. What I felt, more than anything, was something cleaner than gladness. A sense of proportionality, maybe. A sense that the world had briefly been persuaded to make accurate sense. Nathan had looked at me for 3 years and seen someone ordinary, replaceable, someone whose value was in what she might become, not what she already was. He'd treated Amber the same way, more or less. A useful person to be acquired, an upgrade. He'd never once asked who my family was. Never once thought to wonder what was actually behind the careful modesty, the apartment that was chosen for its neighborhood rather than its square footage. The name that wasn't quite the name I was born with. He'd made assumptions, and he'd been so comfortable in those assumptions that it hadn't occurred to him they could be wrong. That is a particular kind of carelessness. And particular kinds of carelessness have particular kinds of costs. Amber left the firm in April. The compliance inquiry concluded with a finding that was significant enough to follow her professionally. Not career-ending, but the sort of thing that closes certain doors and requires explanation at others. She sent me a message through LinkedIn, a few weeks later, that I did not respond to. Somewhere around that time, I ran into Nathan in Kensington Market on a Saturday morning. He was buying coffee from the same place we used to go on weekends, and he looked up and saw me, and I watched his expression go through several things in quick succession before settling on something that wanted to be casual. He said my name. I said hello. He said I looked well. I said thank you. There was a pause that lasted about 4 seconds, which is a long time when you're counting it, and then I said I had to meet someone, and I left. I didn't look back. It wasn't a dramatic exit. There was no one watching. There was just the ordinary morning, the smell of roasting coffee, and me walking north on Augusta with my hands in my coat pockets, feeling, for the first time in a long time, exactly like myself. My father called that evening. We talk on Sundays, usually, but sometimes he calls on Saturdays when there's something on his mind. He asked how I was doing. I told him about the new client file, and the promotion, and a book I was reading, and he told me about a trip he was planning to Prince Edward Island in the summer, and asked if I wanted to come. I said yes. He asked if I was happy. I thought about it for a moment. About the office with the window. About Joanna and the lunch that had made me laugh. About the runs along the waterfront in the early morning when the lake was still and the city was just waking up. About the quiet, accumulated certainty that I had built something true. That everything I had actually earned. Yes, I said. I think I really am. There was a pause, and then my father said, in that dry, precise way of his, good. I was never worried. I smiled. Outside, the Toronto sky was doing that thing it does in spring, where the light stays longer than you expect and the whole city seems briefly, improbably hopeful. I sat by the window and listened to my father talk about PEI, about the Coast Road and Red Cliffs, and a seafood place he'd read about outside Charlottetown. And I thought about how strange and lucky it is to come from someone who picks up on the second ring. Some people never understand what they've walked into, and some things, once lost, are not recoverable, not because the world is cruel, but simply because the world eventually is accurate.